Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to The Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy, with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome back to 2025 to the Hoon whānau on the kaka. It is fantastic to see you all, and particularly Peter, a lovely shirt, I have to say.
Thank you, Bernard. I mean, I saw that shirt of yours that you picked up in Japan, I believe, the other day.
Yes, I went to a second-hand shop.
I think shopping in Japan is a bloody good idea.
Oh, yeah. And the yen's quite weak at the moment, so my lovely daughter and beautiful wife love a good op shop. And there was various streets in Japan where they had just wall-to-wall second-hand clothes shops, and lots of people in there buying, as there are
and
everywhere
Bernard,
else
are we
in the
going to
world.
get complaints now that we're talking about shopping again now, and which is all just too commercial?
Yeah.
We're going down the populist road, but the thing is, both of us like to look as devilishly handsome as we possibly can. And stylish.
If you've got it, you've got to flaunt it.
That's right. That's right. And if you haven't, you've got to flaunt it even more.
Yeah, and this is a big deal. This is our highlight of the week. We've got to put on our glad rags, and we've got to.
Well, Bernard, as you know, I have very little else
show.
to do. But you were hanging out with Christopher Luxon today. I think maybe I've said that my cousin Barney Duncan, who is an extremely amusing comedian and actor, I can't now see Christopher Luxon's face without having seen Barney when he performs, describing them as a thumb. And he just totally describes, and all of a sudden you start to see Christopher Luxon as a thumb.
Thumbs up from the Prime Minister today. He was
growth. We're going for growth.
Going for growth, except he doesn't have a plan. He has an aspiration to get in money from overseas to invest in our various projects, including roads. The trouble is...
He also wants to drill, baby, drill, if we can call mining drilling, doesn't he?
Yes. It seems quite a common thing for people on the centre-right to say and do at the moment. And unfortunately, though, his government has launched a fiscal policy tightening right at the worst possible moment, when the monetary policy settings of the Reserve Bank were at their most extreme, and the shock treatment of stopping new building via Kāinga Ora, stopping school building, at least for the first 6 months, putting council finances into complete turmoil, forcing through rates increases, increasing fees for immigrants and for tourists. Suddenly, shock horror, they're a bit surprised that the recession, which had already been going for well over a year when they got into power, has continued on and is continuing on into the first quarter. Shock horror, when you withdraw money from the economy and you produce around 34% of the economy, and your aim is to go back down to under 30%, what you're saying to the economy and to businesses,
the people in it,
investors and consumers, is that the government is going to withdraw a combined $64 billion from the economy in the next 3 to 4 years. And the assumption is that households, businesses and international investors and people buying our goods and services overseas will be able to pump back in $64 billion at the least, if we're going to get
we're open for business, Bernard.
We're open for business.
We're bloody open for business. Now, but we didn't agree that we would start with you doing a soliloquy, because I thought we were going to do that when we got onto the New Zealand section.
We will. We'll save that one up.
Because I was struck by David Seymour yesterday celebrating the reduction in
inflation. Did he actually
from
hit you in his car?
From 5.9%, I think it was, to 2.9%. And I thought, in fact, I said on his social media feed, and no doubt he didn't reply, it's quite easy to do that when you create a self-inflicted recession.
Yeah, and this is a real problem for the government now, because it's not just, centre lefties and permanent critics who are saying, hang on a minute, we got you in for growth and you haven't delivered growth. In fact, you've made it worse. And now the big end of town is saying this. So interestingly, Simon...
Do we still have a big end of town?
Well, there are some people in it. That's true. They're mostly New Zealand branches of international companies. We have a few large companies, most of which are former state-owned and in the monopoly, duopoly, quadropoly camp. But, they do a lot of investing and employing and selling and buying. So you've got to keep an eye on them. And the big end of town is now worried as well. So interestingly, Simon Bridges, who's now the Chamber of Commerce boss in Auckland, came out with an op-ed in the Herald last week, essentially saying, "Hey guys, stop it with the mad
talking us down,
trying to cut debt. We don't have a debt problem. It's your job as government to provide stability and confidence." And also, in the backbenches, there are rumblings. I mean, that surprise cabinet reshuffle came after a lot of people on the backbenches are going, hang on a minute, we're getting it in the neck from everywhere in provincial New Zealand about not just housing, but the suspension of house building, the suspension of funding for councils. Everyone in local government land is basically tearing their hair out. And I think Christopher Luxon bought himself another 6 months with that decision. But by the end of the year, if the polls aren't any better, and remember we got a poll just last week saying that National was behind Labor for the first time since the election, then, there's a real risk that he's not here this time next year.
And remind us, Bernard, when David Seymour takes over as Deputy Prime Minister.
Oh, yes. That was exciting.
Takes his real job as Prime Minister. Sorry, Deputy Prime Minister. Yeah.
Simon Bridges asked Christopher Luxon about this in the fireside chat part of the discussion this afternoon. And there was a rumble of sniggers from around the audience. And Christopher Luxon played a very straight bat. But this will be a challenge because, interestingly, this is a coalition government. And one of the real problems, and I asked Christopher Luxon about this afternoon, one of the real problems the government faces is that it is relying on international investment by sovereign wealth funds in New Zealand assets, sometimes in building them. And the last time a New Zealand government tried to do that, bring in a sovereign wealth fund to help build a large piece of infrastructure, was when Quebec's sovereign wealth fund was brought in to help build the rail connection between the Auckland CBD and the airport, and that was gazumped.
Well, that worked well.
It was gazumped by you guessed it, Winston Peters. So the whole strategy outlined today is still dependent on Winston Peters.
Now, Bernard, because you've launched into a bloody diatribe, we haven't said, because we were going to do 2 media stories in this chunk as well. Now we'll
save it for
making poor old Catherine wait. So why don't we go to Catherine in a moment? We're going to have today Catherine. We're going to have Elaine Monahan on from the US. So I'll push those journalism stories because, for example, looking at the New Zealand Herald today, at this moment this afternoon, it doesn't actually have the Christopher Luxon speech on its front page. It has Chris Hipkins' response, but it does have 124 sheep being savaged on Auckland parks, and it has Golriz Golraman. So now we know even more what the Herald's going to look like. It's going to make Auckland look like a crime-ridden hellhole with something like 40 fewer journalists and very quickly. So I'd be surprised if anybody actually read any of Simon's op-ed. I certainly wouldn't have seen it very prominently displayed. So we'll talk a little bit about journalism, and we'll talk about Mr. Trump, President Trump. And also, I hope you noticed, Bernard, before we go to Catherine, I have a sort of celebratory mug, which I found it unpacking a box. It's from the White House Historical Association, and it has every president on it, up to the one who was in power just when I was there, not in the White House, in Washington, which is, of course, Barack Obama.
I have a mug like that. It's got their mug shots on it.
I'm having this. Oh, yeah. Well, this is a more tasteful version of that.
Okay. Mine's very not tasteful.
So over to you now.
Yes.
Two of the biggest executive orders. Or several of the executive orders, Catherine, relate to climate. We've been, in a sense, we've been through this once before with the previous Trump presidency, but then it took 2 years to get out of the Paris climate agreement, and now it's going to take less than a year. It's dead, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think that's the most meaningful thing that he actually did in terms of his executive orders, because, the fact that we've had the last few COPs in petrostates is kind of, done its damage already, and you can kind of see where it's heading. And even, if it takes a year for the US to officially be out, that doesn't really make much difference if they're not aiming at the targets anymore. So for my money, probably the most consequential thing that he's started the train in motion on, it hasn't actually kind of, arrived at the station yet, but he put out an edict or an order asking the head of the EPA to quickly write a report talking about the legality and applicability of efforts to curb greenhouse gases under the endangerment finding. So what that's about is he's trying to stop the EPA from ever regulating greenhouse gases in the US. And so the way that they regulate it at the moment is based on a Supreme Court finding from back in 2007, which said that greenhouse gases were classified as an atmospheric pollutant. So they named 6 specific greenhouse gases that were atmospheric pollutants. And that enables the EPA to do stuff, the Environmental Protection Agency, to regulate emissions under the Clean Air Act. So if what it looks like he's trying to do is to get that back in front of a new Supreme Court, who will agree to the fact that greenhouse gas emissions aren't actually atmospheric pollutants, and therefore the EPA has no right even to regulate them.
Yeah, and it's abandoned the electric car. He's already unwinding a lot of the Biden climate-related and energy transition-related
wind
measures,
power,
right?
electric cars, all sorts of things. He's unwinding everything, but this particular one could curb any kind of federal effort to reduce greenhouse gases into the future. Yeah, in perpetuity, kind of.
Catherine, just thinking about it as a whole, because I see your point about the Paris Climate Agreement, but of course, that puts the United States in with Iran, Yemen and Libya as the only countries not in the climate. Doesn't it just, the whole approach is to surely undermine global efforts? Because when Bernard and I did the pop-up this week, we were trying to work out how to make this relevant from a New Zealand point of view, given that our own government is already pretty much indicating that it's not going to meet its Paris requirements. This is going to give a lot of people air cover for that kind of approach, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely has much more, I guess, of an emotional or diplomatic impact than it does, in terms of their actual specific emissions. And I think that's very true. But I think that was known from the moment that Trump won the election. Those impacts were in play, and I agree. It gives cover for other countries to not try as hard, to do less.
And essentially, now we see what people really want to do. And they know that the covers are off, that they can be themselves, really. And so you're seeing a lot of companies, banks, pension funds dump their net zero targets. A whole bunch of banks in the United States have pulled out of the Net Zero Alliance. You've seen BlackRock and the likes pull out of their, not just their net zero commitments, but also their so-called DEI, so diversity, equity, inclusion commitments. It's like the mask has slipped off.
It's the end of woke, Bernard.
Yeah, it's definitely a good time to get a clear understanding of where the interests lie for those organisations and how they're calculating those interests. So all of the action that they were doing to date, it wasn't because they had a concern for the environment, or there was no moral compass behind it. It was all on the basis of what will get us the best advantage with the current government, and that's how businesses operate. But that kind of reinforces the idea that you need regulation around the way businesses operate, because there is no integrity or moral compass there. It is simply what will deliver the best bottom line results based on whatever government is in place.
And as good capitalists, we understand that, of course.
Yes, but the thing is, but the thing is, if you're a capitalist and you're a realist, and you think about the long term, which you should, because you've been told to look after money for usually 10 or 20 years, then you should look at what actually is going to happen in physical terms on the ground, what it means for the economy and what it means for insurance, what it means for your assets. You know, the climate doesn't care whether you're woke or not. It's going to kill you whether you want it or not. And this is what's interesting. We've seen it's really interesting research out of the most influential and, I think, ruthlessly, capitalistically, but scientifically clear group of people, actuaries. So actuaries, and I'm being a bit rude here, actuaries are like the most autistic, most persnickety, most accurate pain in the asses in corporate life, but they're always bloody right. And they've come out with a really interesting study of the costs of climate change.
Yeah, so for actuaries, their best interests lie in being accurate. So having a positive bias or a negative bias loses them money, So their best interests lie in being accurate, and they may be the only kind of institutional grouping on the planet whose financial interests are best served by that level of accuracy on climate, because governments have other interests and concerns. Most other corporate bodies have other interests or concerns. Actuaries have to get it right, or it costs them money. So this report has come out. This is another report in a series of reports that have been done via a collaboration between the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries in the UK and the University of Exeter, in particular Tim Lenton, who is the guy behind Tipping Points Science. And what they have done is they have looked at the best way to think about risk and risk management from an actuarial perspective. And what that really kind of highlights is that, first of all, most people and most companies and most economists, and even most climate scientists for that matter, don't understand risk particularly well when it comes to economy and society and even climate change impacts. Because when you look at the modelling work for climate change impacts and climate science, they always they look at different scenarios, but they always follow the central estimate from those scenarios and ignore the potential catastrophic risk that might be lurking out to the side and actually be intolerably high, but that just gets ignored because it's not the average path. It's not the, so what these actuaries have, this report that's come out, it's called Planetary Insolvency. We can put it up on the show notes later. They have a different view of risk. They're really sort of looking at A, plausibility, how likely is something to happen, and B, how catastrophic is it if it happens, or how mild is it. So they have those two, and there's some really clear pages where there's like a traffic light system that goes from green, orange to red that shows where we are now in 2025 and where they expect the risk to be in 2050. And I think what you find when you look at that, it's quite shocking in terms of the level of risk that there is to the they look across 4 domains. So they look at climate, nature, society, and economy. And certainly for climate and nature, they're looking at highly likely, highly probable risk of catastrophic results by 2050. And when we talk about catastrophic to extreme results, we're talking about half the global population being killed. You're talking about half GDP's halving.
Jesus, don't be so gloomy.
I mean,
actuaries will get you in the end.
That's true.
The important thing about facing the truth, I just put my foot on the fan on the floor down here.
There's a lot more than your,
nearly lost my toes.
Foot going into the fan right now.
There's nearly a catastrophic risk right there. So, I mean, the important thing about looking at what the real situation is that that's the only opportunity that you have to do something about it. You have to first recognise what the problem is before you can
also just blame Gavin Newscomb for everything that's gone wrong in California. But just quickly, Catherine, before we move to the scene of the crime in Washington with Elaine, what are the implications for New Zealand
from that particular report? I mean,
just what you're seeing right now. The fact that I don't feel I know where we stand on because I don't have a minister in cabinet as we did before under Labour.
Yeah.
telling us constantly where we stand on climate. I mean, I think we're kind of brushing it. As someone said today, we might be whitewashing it.
Yeah, well, we still, I mean, we've talked about this in previous weeks where New Zealand has an obligation under the Paris Agreement to buy international credits, carbon credits, and there's no pathway for that at the moment. So it's looking, it's looking very like we're going to renege on our Paris Agreement targets. There's no viable pathway that's been explained by our representatives at the moment. So in terms of the Paris Agreement, that's where we're sitting. I would say that there isn't a current viable path to how we achieve our targets. In terms of the impacts, there's all sorts of things going. If you look at this actuaries report, then a lot of the things we believe about how safe we feel and what our financial and economic risks are underestimated. They're systematically underestimated. So,
well, that's cheery. So
yeah.
I think let's do a session next week on climate about but do a bit of can we do next week maybe do a little bit of a report card about where we stand?
Well, I mean, the guts of it is New Zealand is well behind its Paris Agreement commitments. The world is behind its Paris Agreement commitments. We know that a warming climate is going to create incredibly destructive events. And if we're looking for a reminder or any sort of recency bias to put into our calculations, LA and what happened in the last 10 days.
It was migrants, it was immigrants setting fires and Gavin Newsom badly managing it. So I mean, Elaine, can we move to Elaine?
Go for it, Elaine.
Thank you, Elaine, have you had any sleep? Have you had a lie down since you've come in, or is your head spinning in Washington?
Yes, somewhat.
So tell us what the last few days have been like for you.
So I was actually just trying to remember how many days it has been since the inauguration, and I have absolutely no idea. So that answers your question.
You could count time in executive orders, and numbers per hour.
Well,
and he seems to be doing them like
you've moved
10
on
per
to
hour.
executive order discussions rather than discussions about the Ms. Sanchez's breasts. Thinking of
for goodness sake!
I mean, it is just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, she's kind of ridiculous, but that whole focus on that kind of thing. Although the presence of the oligarchs in that row, ahead of the members of cabinet, ahead of people like Miriam Adelson, who was one of Trump's biggest donors, it was a demonstration, was it not, of his power, not theirs.
Not theirs, meaning the oligarchs?
Not the oligarchs. Not the. I mean, I think we should call them oligarchs now because that's kind of what they are. Especially when you end up with $500 billion being invested in an OpenAI led AI project, which Elon Musk was left out of, which must have been slightly irritating, despite the
and he was whining
hail,
about
we're
it
going
today,
to Mars. This was an extraordinary display of power by Trump, wasn't it? To have those guys there.
Certainly, and it was unprecedented. As you know, there's so many unprecedented things about the inauguration day. It's hard to know where to start. But certainly having this kind of lineup of billionaires ahead of everyone else was, it certainly was a first, and it did seem to kind of make them look less instead of more powerful. Like they were,
Yes.
Coming to worship at the altar of Trump, basically.
Exactly, which they had to do, obviously, from a business point of view, which they've shown that obeisance. They've shown, as we've talked before about what Tim Snyder, the historian, calls advanced, anticipatory obeisance. Now,
right.
Elaine, you were in Moscow. You've worked in Moscow. Hey, did you watch the rise of the oligarchs when you were there? I'm trying to remember the exact period with it. We who is the new Berezovsky here, and who's going to be Khodorkovsky and go to jail?
Well, I mean, it's impossible not to see the parallels here, and also not to see the perils for these gentlemen.
Nice parallels. Let's just say that again, because it's impossible not to see the parallels and perils. That's very eloquent.
That's
good.
Yeah. So just tell us what those parallels are.
Well, it's certainly true that it looks as if these business people are now kind of immersed in governance in a way that is unusual. And they seem to have a much more entwined relationship with Trump than I would say than the Russian equivalents have, where they were basically told, you just stay out of politics and everything will be fine. Like, you just don't get in the way of my power. And this is something more kind of intricate than that.
Yeah.
And somebody who was, I'm trying to remember, I think it was Ezra Klein I was listening to today, who was talking about this idea that this is an economy of attention, not an economy of money. And that they were representing this attention economy was on full display, which for me left me feeling like, well, it also is a commentary on Trump himself that this is what he values. He values the message and his brand over everything else. So for me, it was a kind of it demeaned him as a leader, because it suggested that he was thinking about how he gets his message out and how he influences people, how he's already hedging against the next election with his behaviour towards TikTok. And
well, why don't you elaborate on that? Because the TikTok one is such an very interesting one to have come up so fast. He's rather rashly asked for ordered a 75-day delay on the court decision, on the imposition of what was actually democratically created legislation, no matter how outrageous it is for the United States to try and ban TikTok. But this is the first really huge transaction, isn't it, of the Trump era?
Right, and it's certainly not clear exactly how that's going to play out, but it does leave you wondering what's going on in his head. That, is this TikTok relationship really about him looking ahead to the upcoming elections, assuming they happen, and trying to make sure that he has full control of every potential channel through which he might communicate, or through which others might communicate.
Could be worth that TikTok could be worth $1 trillion, which of course is what, I mean, Apple's already gone through that, Microsoft's gone through that. Right. I think Meta is near there, and he was talking today about a kind of 50-50 joint venture.
Right.
If the president decides.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. Essentially, Trump is injecting himself into these discussions about what are effectively private assets in a way that Putin did a few years ago when a couple of the oligarchs started to get a bit antsy. And he basically pulled them in, put them in prison, and basically said, here's the deal. You can be oligarchs, I can be president, but you've got to give me half. And the details that emerged from the amount of money he was getting came out in those videos that went on to YouTube. Essentially, Trump is being at least very transparent, sort of blatantly transparent about it. At least Putin tried to hide it. and now we're in a position where he's blatantly inventing meme coins, promoting Bitcoin, giving Musk an office with 20 people in the White House, even though he's not been appointed by anyone in some sort of Senate position or anything, suggesting that Musk could buy TikTok. It is mafia Don stuff, it seems, from a distance.
Well, he certainly made clear that if he can't monetize it, he doesn't care about it. And I mean, it would be silly to pretend that American leadership hasn't been about money. But I mean, the sort of blatant disregard for any pretense of managing other considerations that normally goes along with American political speech is quite surprising. And I mean, not to sort of change the topic from the oligarchs too much, but one of the most sort of unprecedented things that's happened this week has been the exchange between, the lecture that Trump got from the Episcopalian, the leader of the Episcopal Church in Washington, where she tried to, not exactly take him to task. She was asking him to show mercy. And
but she's a far left extremist Trump hater.
Rabid, clearly, because she asked him to show mercy. And I mean, obviously, it wouldn't be hard to show a little dignity in a moment like that, or a little humility. And instead, what she got back was social media commentary that included him calling her nasty, which, as you may recall, was the word he used for Hillary Clinton.
And for Chrystia Freeland,
Yes,
the probable next Prime Minister of Canada. Now, Elaine, he also, for people, let's give a little history lesson here, because he used two words or a phrase that I'm not sure a president has used since the sort of 1890s, which was manifest destiny.
Oh.
And this idea that America is going to expand its territory, expand its reach, put the stars and stripes on Mars. Just talk for a minute about manifest destiny and what alarms that phrase will trigger for everybody in the many people in the United States, particularly if they happen to have a Native American Indian heritage.
Well, certainly the implication is that he is seeing himself as an expansionist, right? So, and there's another parallel, obviously, with Putin. But the sort of big picture for me, whatever rhetoric he's using, the implication of all of it is that it's all about power. It's all about might is right. When he talks about Greenland, it's just another way of, renaming the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, or whatever he's called it. And renaming anything he feels like renaming. So he's projecting his own power onto the entire country and the world, and instructing it that it must behave the same way in order to enjoy his support. And of course, he threatened Zuckerberg with life in prison. So who knows where that may end. So, yeah, I don't know.
So let's put you in the Professor Robert Patman camp, because Professor Robert is travelling in England, and I said that he shouldn't be so mad as to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning just to do the Hoon, although he was quite tempted. What about international relations, the post-war order? He's tearing it all up, isn't he? And this is weird being not extraordinary being a US construction, no?
So, yes, and it's hard to see exactly where that will end either. I think in the end, the last few days, so much has been about him asserting himself into the US context. But then again, he's also stepped away, he's also withdrawn from the World Health Organization, which we knew he would do because he did that last time too. And so the big question is going to be, well, is he going to also pull out of NATO? What will the implications be for the peace processes and conflicts around the world that the United States has traditionally played such an important role in? What are the implications going to be for the Middle East, for this brand new...
Well, hasn't he said effectively that he can deliver on the Saudi Arabia coming into the Abraham Accords, and that will unlock lots of real estate opportunities in Gaza? And I wonder, Elaine, one point that I even heard made today, of course, is that he has in fact kept his promises. He said what he was going to do. He's bent these oligarchs over. He's given them, they're going to invest $500 billion in AI to make the US dominant in that. He's pardoned 1,600 people from January the 6th. He's doing what he said he would do. Is it possible that all of us will see liberals are wrong, and that this kind of realpolitik is the right way, or is going to be successful?
I mean, yes, it's possible. I mean, obviously, I'm certainly hoping that this rhetoric we hear from him is just rhetoric, and that there will be wiser heads prevailing around him. And yes, he certainly has expressed a desire for there to be peace in Ukraine, peace in the Middle East. But we'll have to see what his actual actions are. And if the sort of shock and awe rhetoric that we've been hearing over the last few days replicates itself in other contexts. I mean, I suppose you could make the point that, Putin, whose rhetoric about war and politics has always been shockingly kind of, bullying, violent language. If Trump meets him there, then who knows, maybe they will be able to reach some kind of agreement because they'll recognize each other and come to a deal.
And is the same true, do you think, of Xi over TikTok? I mean, is TikTok actually, weirdly, the first true test?
Well, it certainly could be. I mean, and obviously, like if he if that opens the door to a conversation and builds towards a new relationship with China.
Oh, we have TikTok. You can have Taiwan.
Well, something like that, right? Now that obviously doesn't sound like something we should be happy about.
I just
Suggesting-
have I have one more question for because we have a guest coming in the Auckland section as well, and I know this might take a minute.
Go ahead.
You're also a journalism professor, a long-time journalist. I posited a theory in Bernard and my pop-up one that the very election of Trump has been a failure of journalism. Not necessarily all of its own fault, but the loss of trust, the success of the fake news mantra. You've now got CNN having big job cuts today. You've got, even here in the New Zealand Herald, 40 people out of a staff of 500 or so being fired. And we've seen quite a tone change in the way people are questioning Trump and the whole process. And what's the implications in here for journalism, and have we failed? And answer just in a very quick amount of time.
That's a lot to say
I know.
in a short time.
We might do a whole session on it at some point, and just.
I certainly don't buy
inside
into
baseball.
the idea that journalism made Trump get elected. I think that's just a sort of, it's just wrong. And I think that the sort of shrinkage that we're seeing is part of a much longer term problem that we've been struggling with for years. So, I mean, for me, there are other questions to do with how we report on him. And there's this saying that my mantra all day long has been, when you look at when one person says it's raining and the other person says it's not, journalism's job is not to say, well, Bill said it's raining and Bob said it's not. Journalism's job is to look out the window and say whether it's raining or not.
Who calls it?
And
It's just the weather.
What's that?
It's just the weather.
Yeah, but my point being that, we just have to say things as they are. And that is where
this is okay. So so we know he's told countless lies already. I haven't quite seen whether the Washington Post has reinstituted its lie detector thing. Brian Stelter from CNN, who got fired from CNN for challenging Trump effectively too much, is now back at CNN. Talks a lot about reality-based journalism. That he works for a reality-based network as opposed to Fox. The receptivity to this idea of there actually being facts, and in fact of there being alternative facts. They want, because I would disagree with you about journalism, because I was at CNN when Jeff Zucker was running it, and Jeff Zucker created the possibility of Trump coming in, I think, and Mark Burnett, the producer of The Apprentice.
Right, but then there's also Fox.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I know this is a very common theme that CNN, and I'm not disagreeing. I guess what I'm saying is that it's part of a picture that isn't really about Trump. It's really about journalism and the problems that we're having, monetizing the kind of journalism that we need to do, which is the journalism that actually helps our audiences understand what's the important questions, which are about their lives, their healthcare, their employment, and how are they faring really compared to our friends, the oligarchs.
That's an excellent segue to what Bernard was talking to me about this week, which is, when we were having this conversation, and it is a bit desperate, and it is about, he reckons it's about big brands that have lost their trust, and that it is smaller people, like certain people like Bernard creating the Kaka, who's retained trust and are building trust on places like Substack. So are our listeners and audience going to be the people who absorb, they look more selectively across a range of Substacks rather than opening up a particular major news entity and expecting it to tell them how things are?
Well, there's a lot of research that shows that it's, if you put a name on a journalist or a doctor or a lawyer, people might say, I hate all lawyers or I hate all journalists. But if you introduce them to a specific journalist, that totally changes the dynamic. And so there's I think Substack and other places where journalists can appear as themselves it's a very powerful way of connecting with an audience, but they first have to come and look. And that's the problem, is getting them to pay attention. So, and that's where I think, using technology and audience research to find out what people in your community actually want and need, and then delivering that kind of content that, is life-changing to them. That's the way
Bernard,
to do it.
do you want to respond to that? Because you were very eloquent on this. I don't entirely agree with you, but you were very eloquent, as usual.
Yeah. So the idea is that people have lost trust in what you'd call the establishment. They see them as captured by, big business or big government or whichever flavor of politics you're from, and that they trust individuals who they've watched for a long time, who sometimes they've seen in informal situations, when people make mistakes on videos or, and they can see through the process. I call it a bit like the Lloyds of London building version of
Members.
journalism, so that people can see the journalism as it's being done, and maybe even have an involvement, not so much in terms of having to do all the heavy lifting and the work, but actually suggesting questions, helping to check answers, and because they are in a position to see under the surface a lot more than perhaps they would previously be able to, they can trust it and they can watch it and they can exercise judgment in a very direct way by pulling their subscription or just not watching it anymore.
There's a problem here, though, Bernard, with resources in the time. So it is many of the new Substacks that have emerged, not yours, of course, but they're particularly opinion driven. And they kind of, like a lot of social media, well, I'm not saying Substack is social media, but they sit on the back of the work of real organizations like Reuters, the Associated Press, Washington Post, New York Times. And they just comment on that's very much what I do in my media column, which like I said yesterday, I've parked for several months to try and think how to relaunch it in this era. How do we, but resources are very difficult to get to devote to fact checking. Who knew the New Zealand Herald even had subs?
Yep.
Well, they found them all today.
Yeah. It is interesting to see how you're right. To start with, a lot of the people who are on these platforms are in effect curating the mainstream media's comments. I'd call it the drive-by shooting version of journalism. You point to something interesting, pull your gun from the hip and fire and drive off. Whereas actually, when you can see some of the scale it's building, I obviously follow Substack because that's where I'm based, but Judd Legum, for example, has been breaking stories. So he's doing in-depth research. He's picking up tips. He's checking them. It is quite flavoursome language, and there's no doubting where he's coming from. But he's coming up with new stuff. And for example, one of the things he did in the last, and we'll put a link into the show notes. One of the things he did in the last couple of days was launch a brand new Substack, employed a brand new journalist to focus on Musk's business interests and the conflicts with the government. So the scale is starting to become interesting, where you can start to do that heavy lifting that you're right is expensive.
Well, that's very positive, Bernard, and I think I will take, and I think the audience, hopefully, because people are engaging with us, and as Rob P says, media in New Zealand has been failing to tell us the weather for years, with the exception of the Hoon et al.
Thank you.
Etc. And I hope you don't feel that we are devoting too much of attention to this, but it is something that we have some control over, in a sense that, Elaine is a respected journalist and professor of journalism. I'm a formerly respected journalist of some sort, and Bernard is New Zealand's most respected journalist. It is something we can deal with, and you're all wanting this information. I think that one of the things that I constantly come back to is something that I heard at that Maori journalism event, which was to think about in whose interest is it for us to disbelieve the news. And when Trump, when Elon Musk says that he was trolling us by doing a Roman/Nazi salute yesterday.
Yeah, and there is a danger that in engaging with the shitstorm and the flood the zone merchants, that you dilute your own usefulness and power. And this is where I think just pushing it aside, leaving that for the talk shows, watching their highly produced series of jokes which tell you the news, and then actually looking to
spontaneous.
Oh yeah.
If you wait till the end of the show, I'll tell you my fantastic legal lawyer joke if you like.
Good. and actually just dedicate yourself to going away and digging up brand new stuff and really trying to understand what's going on.
Do you mean as a consumer, Bernard, or do you mean as a journalist?
So, I mean, just to give you an example, this week we had a big change of ministers in the government, bit of a surprise. Simeon Brown, the Transport Minister, becomes the Health Minister. And he did an awful lot of things while he was minister in the last year, which alienated not just all the woke transport planners and bureaucrats, but a whole bunch of National Party voters and council types in places like Warkworth. And so I went into some depth on that with a Warkworth man and transport analyst to explain what it was about Simeon Brown's way of doing things that could be problematic for the health sector. So that's an example of where, some news comes up. It is interesting. It's been covered by the mainstream media, but because there is a room and a need to dive deeper and understand more, and I've got the backing and support of subscribers, I can and should. And that's where I think some of the more independent
Thank you for that.
Characters can do it. Thank you.
I wonder if Walk with Man is going to become Florida Man. Elaine, just before we go to Lucy to talk about quite an upheaval in New Zealand today in the science and technology section, you and I you work at the University of Indiana, and you brought me in on a group that does a sort of social media observation. I think it's called the social media observation.
It's called the Observatory on Social Media.
Somebody in our feed, David Moring, who's always a very clever and perspicacious fellow, said we should set up fact-checking organisations in Otago University, Victoria University, and Auckland, and have them independent and fact-based. The trouble is that then gets into what's happened to this whole world of fact-checking, misinformation and disinformation in a couple of sentences before we move to Lucy.
So my concern about the whole idea of fact-checking is that when you look at the visualization of dis and misinformation in the social media ecosystem, you see something that only exists as a response to the thing that you're trying to resolve. So by having fact-checking, for me, it's like putting healthy skin over a malignant tumour and not treating the tumour. And so all it's going to do is pop up somewhere else, which is not to say there aren't lots of ways of understanding how that system works and potential interventions we could make. But when you study the interventions, you can find out absolutely maddening things like using AI as a fact-checking tool. The research shows, or some research at least shows, has the opposite effect of the one intended. People actually want human beings to fact check for them. We're never going to be able to scale that up. So it's complicated. Sorry.
Yeah. All right. Well, we might do more. Thank you very much to the audience on that one. And Elaine, as always, of course, you're welcome to stay, because I think you get a bit of and our audience loves you, of course. But we're going to go to Lucy, who Bernard's brought in to discuss some contemporary issues in New Zealand. Lucy, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Elaine, and lovely to see you, Lucy. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Hoon.
Artie Farty says fantastic, Elaine, by the way.
Yes, and Lucy is Lucy Stewart. Dr. Lucy Stewart is the co-president of the New Zealand Association of Scientists, and joins us today because finally the government has made some decisions about the structure and nature of our publicly organised and sometimes publicly funded science and development sectors. And there's been some big news. In fact, it was the main substance of the Prime Minister's State of the Nation address, which I attended in Auckland today. And there was quite a bit of debate around there, including with Judith Collins, the outgoing Science Minister, talking about what was being done. And the guts of the changes, for those who haven't caught up with it yet, essentially, the government has decided to shut down Callaghan Innovation. Callaghan Innovation being the publicly organised place for people to turn science into some sort of often business or more developed technology or practice, and to create 3 public research organisations to replace 7 Crown research institutes, and to essentially make the argument that, we're cleaning this up so that our public scientists can get down to the business of creating economic growth with businesses. This has been in the works for a long time. There was a project run by the former Chief Science Advisor, Sir Peter Gluckman, and there's been a lot of worry and delay on this. So, Lucy, as a representative of the scientists' organisation in New Zealand, what did you think of this announcement and the details?
So what fascinated me about this announcement is, I've had a chance to actually read Sir Peter Gluckman's report, which I want to go on record as saying it is thorough, it is well considered. I think it really hits all the high notes of what the real problems have been with our science system, and it has some really good solutions. Unfortunately, the government is not choosing to implement a lot of those solutions. So the report actually says quite explicitly, this isn't a smorgasbord you can pick and choose from. This is a coherent set of solutions that all need to be implemented, and the government has done a bit of picking and choosing. So the reason for that seems to be, we know that a lot of politics has gone on with this. If you look at the cabinet papers that were also released, the minister was going and saying that she wanted to release this stuff in November, and that doesn't surprise me because there was a lot of kind of media talk at the time that the report might be coming out. I was asked multiple times, would I be available for interviews if it came out? And then it came to nothing. And then it's kind of taken another 2 months. So obviously some cabinet dissension going on there. But more specifically, the announcement was laser focused around commercial opportunities, around commercialization, and really around this notion that, we spend a whole $1.2 billion on the science system, and what do we get for it? And we need to be making those lazy scientists get out there and make some money for the country.
Create the electric fence.
Precisely. Whereas Sir Peter Gluckman's report is actually extraordinarily clear that we have an incredibly underfunded science system, and that is what is hampering us, is this idea that science investment is a cost that the taxpayer bears rather than an investment that creates value for New Zealand.
Interesting. So, Bernard, will you paraphrase or something? Because Lucy, I'm not sure that we will see any other journalists other than Bernard necessarily, maybe New Zealand Geographic, looking properly at the Gluckman report, because I think that is such an the picking and choosing is what we sometimes do on fast moving reports like the budget and so on, but we do need to say this is not a Woolworths pick and mix.
Yeah, and it's really great that you've pointed to that report, and we'll make sure there's a link in it to the show notes, Lucy. Just because I was at the event, and the gloss was put over it that this was done in tandem with reaching out to international investors who could then invest in New Zealand science and New Zealand development of, amazing things with genetic modification. And the government was changing the law so that, all these scientists in New Zealand who'd been frustrated by not being able to do research into genetic modification would be able to be unleashed and do amazing things. What strikes me about this, though, is that it, as you've suggested, doesn't go to the heart of the matter, which is how much resource are we putting into this, and also how far behind are we with the rest of the world. So one of the great criticisms from the OECD and others is that we invest about half as a percentage of GDP of other countries. And there are various ways you can invest in R&D. You can get companies to do it, and you can get the government to do it, and you can have the university sector to do it. And every country that has high amounts of productivity growth and investment in R&D does a couple of things. Firstly, they have tax breaks for it. And secondly, they often have a very open approach to allowing public funds to be used in universities or in defence establishments or whatever, for that to be that IP to essentially being handed over to the local businesses. And the best example I can think of that is the extraordinary amount of investment that went in from the Western powers during the Second World War and in the Cold War period afterwards into the miniaturization of electronics, radar, computing, jet engines, all of those things, which, were not very useful at the time. You could only blow things up with them. But then, of course, you get the advent of the jet age.
So
You
are you saying
get
we need a good war to get ourselves, hardened up again, Bernard, and start producing some decent Mosgiel blankets and Bren guns?
yeah.
Bernard, there's also a slightly more recent one. So is this because I lent you my copy of 1944? I think
Well,
it is because
I
you've been,
I think a lot
yeah,
about
the
what is
war.
it that triggers productivity growth, public investment, new
Yeah,
technology, and development. I mean, no one went to Oppenheimer or Rutherford. Maybe Trump might have, if he'd understood anything about who split the atom and who didn't. But no one went to them and said, "We want you to make money out of this nuclear thing you're doing. We think it's really important that you find out how to create all this energy because we've got a great idea to use the energy." No, they said, we want you to do this because we want to do it before the Nazis do
yeah,
it,
yeah.
and then we want to use it to stop a war or
Jesus. As usual,
whatever.
Bernard, it's a little more complicated than that. Shall we perhaps say the Human Genome Project was a good example of that? A lot of the basic research on AI was a good example of that. And as somebody said to me before, when I was pursuing Elaine to be a bit harder on a question, can we get Lucy to have a bloody word in, please,
Oh,
Bernard?
sorry. Yes.
Well,
So
I
Lucy,
actually have a really good example from New Zealand. So there's my actual scientific background is in extremophile microbiology, and there is a little bacteria that likes to live in hot pools in New Zealand. Um, that they did some study on it, and they found that there was an enzyme in it which is called TAC, and TAC is the basis of all you guys will have heard about of PCR because of COVID testing, right? They did COVID
Ah,
PCR tests. The basis of all PCR is TAC, and that was isolated from a bacteria, from a New Zealand hot spring. And New Zealand never saw any benefit from that.
why not? Do we
So
not just because I used to I
well,
was sent
because
to
it wasn't done in New Zealand, and then it was kind of publicly available, and it was commercialized in the US. So there's some interesting examples here of we need to be doing this basic research, because maybe if we had done that here, we would have commercialized it here and got the patients,
and
and
especially
then
things
we'd be
like that,
singing a different
Lucy, because
story.
it's that whole we know about the theoretically we're in the Pacific. We know theoretically quite a lot about those vents in the Pacific. There must be something about that with the geothermal aspect.
Well, I can tell you, as a former deep sea hydrothermal vent researcher, the government is not terribly interested in funding me to go and look at deep sea hydrothermal vents, but if they want to change their mind on that, I'm always available.
If you can find lithium there, can you find lithium down there?
Not off the top of my head, I don't think so. I think there's quite a lot of
Manganese is the
copper.
main thing, right?
Yeah, copper and manganese. The problem is, of course, as a microbiologist, I have to note you would be destroying a fragile, delicate, and beautiful ecosystem that is probably really important to the geochemical cycling of the oceans in order to get that copper and manganese.
Yeah,
So,
well, it's a trade-off.
just yes. Well, just one final question for Lucy.
Well, you
From
think
you,
it's final, Bernard.
yeah.
You'll be the judge of that. Thank you.
One of the things that struck me about how the government has handled its cuts of government staff and uncertainty around restructurings is that there's been a whole lot of people have gone, "I'm not going to hang around here for the email to tell me that I've lost." I got an email from someone at the University of Melbourne 3 weeks ago,
yep.
and you know what? I just checked the flights, and it's only $500 to go there, and
Yep.
they're going to pay for my stuff to be moved to Melbourne or whatever. What are you seeing in the industry around people that are leaving? Because the other piece of news that came out today was that we're still seeing an exodus of New Zealanders to Australia at a rate of about 200 people a day, one A320 load. How many of those are scientists?
I mean, I couldn't say, in specific numbers, but a few of them will be. I believe I heard that ESR is actually like supporting its staff that it's just made redundant to find jobs in Australia, because they know
Oh,
that
good.
their staff
That's
will
helpful.
not find jobs in New Zealand. We know a lot of people who were made redundant from like NIWA and GNS last year have gone overseas. So often these are people who, immigrated to New Zealand to do research here, to contribute to our society, and then they've gone, well, why should I stick around when you don't want me? And it is kind of outrageous to me that the government has put out this press release today saying we need to attract skilled people to New Zealand, and it's like, could we stop making them redundant
Repel them.
and
Yeah.
sending them
Do they
overseas
know about
first?
attraction and repulsion?
Apparently not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And Lucy,
we
just
do really well with magnets. Yeah.
you're probably too young to remember this, but we used to have a thing called the DSIR.
I know of the DSR because I worked at GNS for a while,
Yeah.
and when I was there, nearly half the researchers were over 60, so I'm familiar with the DSIR through there.
So, and Australia has the CSIRO still, I believe,
Yes.
which I think has come up with, is it the best weight loss program ever? There's a CSIRO diet that Bernard and I should be on if we want to live into our 70th year. But what's the is it that all this becomes a political football, or is something like the DSIR just a legacy of that sort of government knows best era of the 60s and 70s and 80s to some extent?
I mean, I don't think so. The Sir Peter's report actually did recommend kind of a return to a single public research organisation, perhaps with the exception of ESR, because they do a lot of really specific work kind of for public health and the police. And I find it very interesting. The report specifically says that partial mergers are not recommended. We need to
No.
go all the way to a single agency. And the government has chosen to go to partial mergers. I don't actually think merging CRIs is a bad idea. I think it's quite a good idea, but I'm interested that they've had a report recommending so strongly they should go to a sort of zero model, and they've chosen to stop halfway.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I
Well,
would
Hoon is
love
the
to know
place to
why.
call that out, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lucy, just one final question for me, because I like to get the last word in always. What do you think Sir Paul Callaghan would have thought of what's happening, not just today, but in the last couple of years? Because he made some really good points about how New Zealand lacked investment in its businesses and its people and its research and its development. And he got a lot of excitement going about maybe we could do this. And both sides of politics really backed him. Today is the day when his baby, well, at least the thing that his name was applied to, was dismantled. And we're now still talking about this, but no one really believes it because we're actually cutting spending going into R&D, and we haven't changed the core incentive in our economy, which prioritizes investment in leveraged residential property over everything else. It's the reason our R&D is half that of other countries who do have capital gains taxes, and it's the reason that our real wages and productivity growth has been so low, and the reason we have one A320 load of people leaving every day. What do you think Paul Callaghan, now deceased, what do you think he would think?
And it's always hard to speak for dead people you've never met, but certainly based on the writing he has left behind him, I don't think he would be very impressed. And I really note that this government, the last national government, for all the things they did that I can't approve of, they brought in the National Science Challenges, which was moving the money around a bit, but it was we were committing to big mission-led science. That was really cool. They brought in a Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor. We had Callaghan Innovation. All those are gone now.
We still don't have a Chief Science Advisor, do we?
Nope. And
also,
specifically in the report envisions the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor playing a key role in the Science and Technology Advisory Council they want to establish. That is not in the announcement. Very specifically.
Lucy, you'll never become a completely successful journalist and commentator without being able to insert your views into the ideas of a dead person.
I guess I'm just too noble for that.
Thank you so much, Lucy, and thank you very much,
welcome.
Elaine. It's been lovely to have you on the Hoon.
Now,
Thank
Bernard, you're going to be doing the skateboarding dog today, and I find it one of the most depressing skateboarding dogs I've ever bloody heard of. But I will tell you, if people want to hear it, I will tell the lawyer joke as well.
Yes. So this is all about the January 6 rioter who became quite famous because of the hat he wore. He wore that horned hat with all sorts of fur, and the
QAnon shaman.
That's right, the QAnon shaman. And he was convicted for causing all sorts of drama and sentenced to prison for 41 months. He was pardoned this week by Donald Trump, and his first comments upon being released from prison and being told that he had been pardoned was to say that he was absolutely thrilled about being pardoned. Jacob Chansley is his name. And he had some plans for what he was going to do when he got out. And he said that essentially he was going to, and I quote, he was thrilled to get out because now he was going to go out and buy some mother effing guns. Here's the quote. "I got a pardon, baby!" Exclamation mark. "Thank you, President Trump!" Exclamation mark. "Now I'm going to buy some mother effing guns."
Nice. Thank you.
I
Bill.
love this
That is
country.
the most depressing skateboarding
God
dog.
bless America. And that's one of the slightly ominous things about this. He released 1,600 people, and they are now prime candidates for some sort of Trump
Some sort of militia. Exactly. Exactly. No, I look, let's talk about it. Fascism. This is what it looks like. This is how it's going to feel. So on that cheery note, shall I quickly do the lawyer joke?
Yes, please.
Have you heard that scientists are replacing lab rats with lawyers?
No, why?
Yeah, because they'll do anything, and the scientists don't get attached to them.
Oh, that's good. Love it. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Peter.
everybody. Thank you, Bernard. You had a couple of raves in there today.
Oh, good. No, it felt a bit ranty today.
Yeah.
No, I felt a bit editorial
And thank you to
today.
everybody who criticised. Well, one person actually who just said, "I want to hear Elaine, not you, Peter." Just if anybody knew how I have to keep this bloody tempo going, poor old Simon's in there tearing up what hair he doesn't have.
That's right.
Thank
Thank you very much, everyone. Ka kite anō. We'll see you all next week.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.